My name is Jim Riddle, and I work as Organic Outreach Coordinator for the University of Minnesota Southwest Research and Outreach Center. I've been doing that for 6 years, but for 20 years I was an organic inspector and helped start the International Organic Inspectors Association. Served a 5-year term on the USDA National Organic Standards Board that sets the regulations, which now in the U.S. for the last 10 years, when something's labeled organic, it has to have been produced and processed according to federal organic standards. So very proud to have been a part of setting those standards and helping make sure that when something says organic, it is what it means, so that people that purchase the products are getting the real thing. Yeah, I was raised on a small farm in central Iowa. We had a few dairy cows and raised sweet corn, and my mom always gardened, and I helped with the garden, and we subscribed to Organic Gardening magazine, so I'm sure that was quite an influence on me growing up. And we canned food and produced a lot of our own, so I've been in touch with food production for my own family forever. But also when I went to college, I studied ecology and biology and natural systems, and really saw some of the impacts that conventional farming practices have on people's health. The cancer rates in Iowa are very high, birth defects, family members with cancer and other health problems related to farm chemicals. And so all that has contributed to the work that I've chosen to do, which is dedicated a whole lot of my time and energy into organic farming, and then also into educating other organic farmers and building the regulatory system so that we have confidence in that word organic. Yeah, well, what does organic mean? Well, I mentioned it's now regulated, and there is a legal definition of organic production, and I'll just read it. Organic production is a production system, so it's really a systems approach to agriculture that's managed to respond to site-specific conditions, so what's happening on that farm, by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. That's in the Code of Federal Regulation. That's how organic is defined under the law. But what does it mean in practical terms? Well, it's essentially food that's grown in harmony with nature, not using cancer-causing pesticides or fungicides or synthetic fertilizers, and not any allowance for genetic engineering in organic food. And it's really the only label in the U.S. right now that if a person is concerned about genetic engineering, and we can talk about that more in a little bit, but wants to avoid genetically engineered foods, organic is your only label choice because GMOs are not required to be labeled. So organic, it's prohibited under the U.S. regulation to use GMOs. So that's another important part of it. And then also, it don't have all the preservatives or artificial colors or flavors, or the food's not been irradiated or grown using sewage sludge. But on the positive side, the organic farmers are really building the soil, and that's critical to having healthy foods, healthy plants, and healthy people, and really a healthy planet to live on is to build the soil health, the organic matter, protect the groundwater, and keep the living system, the biology of the soil and the plants all healthy and thriving. I mean, there's a lot of interest in natural foods, but natural doesn't have a definition, whereas organic does. Natural can be used by anyone, and it's very confusing. But when organic appears on a product label or on the shelf, it has to be grown and processed according to the U.S. regulation. So what does that mean? Well, a farmer has to not use prohibited materials, so no synthetic pesticides or fertilizers for 3 years before that land even qualifies to get certified. So then they have to, that's the transition period it's called. The land goes through transition. The farmer fills out about a 14-page organic plan where they describe everything they're growing and planning to grow, everything they use, everything they plan to use, the source of seeds, how they plant, cultivate, harvest, store, package, and the record-keeping system they use. So that all has to be put on paper and submitted to a USDA accredited certification agency. That means that USDA essentially certifies the certifiers. So they go out and make sure that the agencies that issue the organic certificate have the competency, freedom of conflict of interest, qualifications to do the job. If they do, then they're essentially deputized by USDA. So the Idaho Department of Agriculture is an accredited certification agency. Washington State Department of Agriculture also is accredited. So a farmer submits that organic plan to one of these accredited certification agencies. They will review it, make sure it's complete. They're going to look at the farm maps, the field history, all the details that are in there, and then they will send out an inspector. And the inspector looks at every aspect of the operation, looks at the labels of the seeds, all the different inputs that are being used, walks the fields, looks for weeds, insects, diseases, the condition of the soil, also looks at the borders to assess whether there's a risk of drift from adjoining land, and then looks at how the crop's going to be harvested, where it's going to be stored, looks at the equipment, what kind of condition it's in, spends a lot of time looking at the farmer's records, and then at the end of that annual, has to happen every year, this inspection, the inspector does what's called an exit interview, where they sit down with the farmer or with the processor. It could be a processing operation too that's getting inspected, and does what's called an exit interview, kind of goes through, okay, this is what I saw, this is the additional information you need, or here's some potential problems that are going to appear in my report. So nobody's getting blindsided. It's upfront, it's transparent, but the inspector doesn't make the decision. The inspector files a report, goes back to that certification agency. They look at all the information and hold it up against the standards and decide whether a farm is certified or not. Once they're certified, then they can use that word organic on their products. And if they want to, they can also use that USDA organic logo. So you see that logo on a lot of processed products now, but really what's important is look for the word organic, because that's what's regulated, as opposed to a word like natural or locally grown or things that have no legal definition. Why organic? That's a good question. Well, at the farm level, I guess I'll just there's a lot of farmers concerned about the pesticides they're using, conventional farmers. And I remember one inspection I was on, and I always like to ask the question, why are you going organic? Especially when it's someone who's new. And I remember one young farmer's answer. He'd been a conventional farmer, been through the pesticide applicator training and learned how you're supposed to protect your family's health because you're supposed to wash your clothes separately and 3 times rinse the machine before the rest of the family's clothes is even run through after you've applied pesticides. And I remember him saying that when I get off the tractor, I want to be able to come in the house and hug my kids and not feel like I might poison them. And so it was very personal, his reasons, but I heard that was the most common reason I hear from farmers to protect their own health, to protect their family's health, and to not poison their livestock. They care deeply about their animals. So that's one reason, at the farm level. But at the for the consumer, for the person choosing to buy organic, what's in it for you? Well, the research and even this, the Stanford study that came out recently even confirmed that organic foods consistently have no pesticide residues or very low levels of pesticides compared to conventional foods. And when they do have any pesticides, it's almost always just one compound, whereas for conventional foods, consistently have multiple residues of foods. And there was one study out of University of Washington where a group of 23 5-year-olds were fed a regular conventional food kid diet, and their urine was tested for organophosphate insecticides. every one of those children had the presence of those insecticides in their urine eating regular food. Switched over to an organic diet, and after 5 days, every one of them dropped to a non-detectable residue levels in their urine. Put back on the conventional diet, and those levels went right back up. And the researchers concluded that consuming food grown using organic methods can virtually eliminate exposure to a dangerous class of insecticides that's known to disrupt neurological development in infants and children. So, I mean, that strikes home. You know, it's not necessarily an effect you're going to see tomorrow, but with pesticides, it's really it can be a very small dose, but it's the critical time in the development of a fetus or a young body or the brain development when that pesticide can trigger changes or disrupt endocrines, the hormonal system. So it doesn't have to exceed the EPA tolerance for a pesticide to cause harm if it's consumed or the exposure occurs at a critical time in development. So, I mean, that's a reason to avoid exposures, but then the trends of the bona fide research that's happening these days consistently show that organic foods have higher levels of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. And some research from UC Davis, very interesting, long-term study, 10 years, side by side, organic and conventional tomatoes, and looking at the level of antioxidants in the tomatoes and finding that over time with the organic methods those levels just keep going up, whereas the conventional just stayed flat. 10 years, same soil type, just the organic is adding compost and building the biology of the soil. So that's reflected in increasing levels of antioxidants in those foods. So those really, I think, it's a good investment. But the other reason, it's a big picture. It's the earth we live on, and especially the water we drink. Research from University of Minnesota, Washington State University have shown conclusively that organic practices prevent nitrate contamination of groundwater. And also we see all kinds of both ground and surface water contaminated with things like atrazine, allichlor, other kinds of carcinogenic pesticides, and organic farmers don't use those. So we're preventing the groundwater and the surface waters from being contaminated by these pesticides as well. And that's really the number one nutrient we all need is good, clean water. What does it take for a livestock operation to get certified? Because there's a lot of interest in organic meats and especially dairy. Dairy is one of the first things that a lot of families turn to organic because they want to feed their children, their infants, the best food they can. And so for a livestock operation to get certified organic, they have to feed 100% organic feed. So all of the pasture, all the hay, all the grains has to have been raised under certified organic conditions to begin with. But then they also have to have good animal husbandry, good preventative health practices to keep the animals healthy, because the use of antibiotics is prohibited, the use of any growth hormones is prohibited, and if it's an operation like that raises cattle or goats or yaks, ruminant grazing animals, those animals must be on pasture the majority of the time. Anytime what's called the grazing season, where there's forage out there for the animals to graze, the organic standards now require that the animals be on pasture. And there's quite a few studies now that show that meat and milk from animals that graze have higher levels of the healthy amino acids, the conjugated linoleic acids, the CLAs, which are actually very health promoting, and those levels are consistently higher in organic dairy and meat because the animals have been out on pasture. And I've been on a lot of organic operations, and one thing that was quite surprising that I saw repeatedly once an organic dairy farmer especially switched to organic, their vet bills just dropped dramatically. The animals were healthier, they were getting more exercise, they were eating better, but they were living longer and breeding better. So the rate of infertility was much less when they switched, and they had fewer health problems, fewer hoof problems, lameness, and no spontaneous abortions, and just farm after farm. I've seen that, and that's something that needs to be researched a lot more, is what is happening when a farmer switches to organic management for their animals in terms of the positive impacts on health, and what can we learn as humans from what's happening when a farmer switches to 100% organic feed. Maybe we'd see some of the same results in ourselves. I think there is cause to be concerned about genetic engineering, and if people don't realize what's happened in the last, it's a little, about 15 years now, is crops have been developed in the lab containing genes from totally different kingdoms of organisms. So you'll have a corn plant that has genetic material from a bacterium inserted in it. And this corn actually has a toxin from this bacterium, so that the corn itself is a pesticide. It's registered with EPA as a pesticide. And that corn then is used in all sorts of products. This high fructose corn sweetener all comes from this GMO corn, various corn oil products, and it gets into all sorts of conventional foods. And these things aren't labeled as a product of genetic engineering. And there are some real problems that we're seeing with the widespread adoption of genetically engineered crops. They're escaping. The canola, which is bred to be sprayed multiple times with Roundup herbicide, is now escaping and breeding with wild relatives because it's in the mustard family. There's now over 20 species of weeds that have developed resistance to Roundup or glyphosate because of the widespread adoption of genetic engineering of Roundup-ready corn, soybeans, cotton, canola. So you have the same traits, the same pesticide being sprayed year after year, so the weeds have developed a resistance. But also the insects have now developed resistance to the Bt toxin that's in every cell of the plant. Some of the insects survive, they find each other and breed, and have developed populations of Bt resistance in corn rootworms, for example. But also that Bt toxin, that pesticide, stays in the corn plant, the corn crop residues, and is being found in water courses. In Indiana, there's research there showing that it persists in the streams and rivers at least 6 months after the corn harvest. And now it's being found to be toxic to caddisfly larvae. And if you're a trout fisherman, you might have heard caddisflies are really a keystone species in the aquatic ecosystem. A lot of other organisms eat caddisfly larvae. And this was not predicted, it was not researched in advance, but now we're finding that this genetically engineered corn is toxic to caddisfly larvae, also toxic to lady beetles and monarch butterflies, swallowtail butterflies. Their populations have dropped dramatically since the introduction of genetic engineering. But there's research also from Canada showing that this Bt toxin from the GMO corn is found in the bloodstream of humans, and it's actually crossing the placental barrier and found in the blood of fetuses and infants. So it's becoming part of our bodies, and research out of France is showing, this is in lab animals so far, showing liver and kidney damage from this kind of genetically engineered corn. There hasn't been near enough research in this country, largely because the whole genetic engineering industry is under what's called a substantial equivalence doctrine that dates back as far as Dan Quayle. It was done to commercialize genetic engineering and rush it to market. So there have been no long-term human health studies required before these products are introduced into the environment and into the human food stream. There's been no long-term ecological impact studies required of these before they've been rushed to market. And it's very difficult for the researchers to get access to these patented seeds in order to do the research, because the biotech companies retain ownership of the seeds. Even the farmers who grow them don't just buy the seeds. They sign a licensing agreement because the biotech companies continue to own that DNA. So it's very difficult for the researchers to have access to do the research either on the environmental impacts or on human health impacts. And so that's, certainly a cause for concern. There needs to be honest assessment of these. But in the meantime, I, certainly embrace the precautionary principle, which is until you know something doesn't cause harm, don't release it into the environment or into the human food source. And if you're concerned about it, buy organic, which is the only label where genetic engineering is prohibited. Well, if a person wants to buy organic food and you're on a budget, I think planning ahead is a really good approach. First, if you're planning big time, plant your own garden. That's a great way to get good, healthy, fresh, organic food. Teach your children. It's a wonderful activity, good exercise, etc. But also shopping at a farmer's market, joining a CSA or community-supported agriculture group. But buying real foods, whole foods, cooking with your family, having family meals, avoiding highly processed foods, but also buying things when they're on sale, stocking up, planning ahead. These are all important, but you have to understand that conventional food is highly subsidized. So organic food pays the farmer a fair price directly rather than paying for cheap food, which is really not cheap. It's subsidized through our tax dollars, and then we get bad nutrition that leads to health problems, and we pay either on the front end and enjoy good health, or we pay on the back end and have health problems through eating cheap, quote-unquote, food. So where can people get more information? Well, just a few websites that I would recommend. If you'd like to view the entire video, it's of course available on the Pilgrim's Market website, but also the University of Minnesota has an organic ecology website called organicecology.umn.edu. National Extension has a lot of good resources, especially for farmers, but videos. There's an organic YouTube channel. You can find articles, webinars about organic production at eOrganic.info. But if you want to learn more about what some of the nutrition and pesticide residues, the Organic Center is an excellent source, and it's just organic-center.org. And then the Organic Trade Association, or OTA.com, has a lot of good materials, as well as companies like Organic Valley have a lot of good materials at their website. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. I encourage you to find reputable sources of information and look at the NOP, the National Organic Program, if you want to truly understand the organic regulations and what's happening as far as proposed changes. Go to the USDA's National Organic Program website.